These 7 behaviors quietly convey your worth to every person around you without requiring you to utter a single word about it. And Carl Jung's genuinely uncomfortable truth is that you already possess all of them somewhere within you. But one concealed psychological pattern is systematically dismantling them before anyone in your life ever gets to witness what you actually carry. It does not unfold dramatically. It does not announce its presence. It manifests in the way people speak, in the way they diminish themselves to fit whatever environment they enter, in the way they dilute themselves repeatedly until the dilution becomes so automatic they no longer notice it happening. They please others at their own expense. They over-explain every decision. They perform acceptability. And still, after all that draining effort, they find themselves asking why nobody treats them the way they genuinely deserve. Why the people they care about most seem to regard them least seriously. Why they feel unseen in rooms they have every right to occupy completely. Here is what Jung would actually say about that. Worth is not a social currency. Jung was almost entirely unconcerned with worth as something accumulated through impression management and calculated likability. What occupied him was something considerably less negotiable. He called it teleology, the understanding that the soul carries a purpose it is actively attempting to fulfill, and that this purpose holds its own objective weight regardless of whether anyone around you is presently capable of perceiving it. When you stop attempting to demonstrate your worth and start moving in genuine alignment with your actual purpose, something shifts permanently. You stop seeking external confirmation and begin radiating a quality of presence that others cannot dismiss regardless of how much they might prefer to. Carl Jung once observed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Genuinely profound words. But here is the uncomfortable reality concealed behind that statement that almost nobody acknowledges when they share it. Most people are deeply and authentically terrified of becoming who they are, because doing so demands something brutal as a prerequisite. It demands confronting the shadow. And the shadow, in Jungian psychology, is not simply what you consciously chose to conceal. It is every dimension of your personality that operates entirely outside your conscious awareness. Every impulse you never realized you carried. Every raw and unresolved piece of you that functions without your knowledge or permission. Society has constructed a remarkably efficient mechanism for keeping that shadow buried. It labels the person who does not require external validation as arrogant. It designates the person who chooses genuine solitude as antisocial. It tells the person who challenges comfortable collective assumptions that they are too much, too intense, too complicated. And it does this persistently, because the moment you stop needing approval, the system forfeits its leverage over you entirely. What follows are 7 specific behaviors extracted directly from Jung's body of work that quietly and permanently alter the way people encounter you. Not through manipulation, not through performance, through something far rarer and far more genuinely potent. Authentic psychological depth. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Your greatest and most beautiful journey is the one that leads you back to yourself. Subscribe to Carl Jung Philosophy and hit the like button, and let's walk that path together. The first behavior is shadow integration. Without question, it is the most transformative behavior on this entire list, and positioning it first is deliberate, because without it, every subsequent behavior remains a technique rather than an expression of something authentically real. Jung believed that within every human being resides a shadow. Not literally, but psychologically. And here is the dimension most people consistently misunderstand. The shadow is not simply the things you consciously chose to conceal. It is the layer of your personality that exists entirely outside your conscious field. Not the imperfections you feel guilty about and attempt to correct, the patterns you do not even realize you are executing. The anger you do not identify as anger. The envy that presents itself as a legitimate sense of injustice. You did not deliberately bury these things. You are simply unaware they exist. And that unawareness grants them an authority over your life that nothing on the conscious surface can effectively counteract. Most people spend their entire existence fleeing a shadow they cannot perceive, projecting it onto others and condemning those others intensely for the very qualities they most aggressively refuse to acknowledge within themselves. And this is precisely where they surrender power. Because the dimensions of you that you decline to acknowledge do not vanish. They descend underground, and from underground they govern your life. They surface as disproportionate responses to minor provocations. They emerge as the unconscious undermining of genuinely good circumstances. They appear in the fierce contempt you carry toward people who openly exhibit the qualities you have most thoroughly suppressed in yourself. Jung was direct about something most people are genuinely unprepared to receive. Integrating the shadow does not make existence easier. It makes you whole. And wholeness is not a comfortable condition. The process is frequently disorienting because it fractures the ego's carefully maintained self-image. The version of yourself you believed you were begins to crack. What replaces it is far more honest and far more resilient than any performance of virtue ever was. The individual who has genuinely confronted their own darkness has exchanged a flawless facade for a complex, honest reality. And that reality does not buckle under pressure because there is genuinely nothing remaining to defend. Consider a pattern Jung documented repeatedly across his clinical work. Someone who prides themselves on being infinitely patient and selfless, who never refuses requests, never expresses anger, who by every external appearance is a deeply generous person. But over time, a pattern surfaces. Whenever someone else receives recognition they felt they deserved, something shifts beneath the surface. Subtle resentment emerges. They begin to undermine that person in small, deniable increments. Passive withdrawal, withheld encouragement, quiet sabotage. And they are genuinely perplexed. because consciously they do not experience themselves as envious. The envy inhabits the shadow, operating entirely without permission below the threshold of awareness. Contrast that with someone who has actually engaged in shadow work, who examined their own envy, their own resentment, their own suppressed rage, and said clearly, "I see you. I comprehend why you exist. You are part of what it means to be human." This person can experience envy without being governed by it. They can observe jealousy without acting from it. They can acknowledge anger without becoming it. And that level of self-mastery is perceptible in every single interaction they have. Begin paying genuine attention to what provokes intense judgment in you when you observe others. The qualities that disturb you most in other people are almost invariably the qualities you have most thoroughly suppressed in yourself. That is not a character deficiency. It is a map, revealing precisely where your shadow is stored. Rather than reacting automatically, cultivate genuine curiosity. Why does this particular quality disturb me so thoroughly? What dimension of me recognizes this pattern from within? That transition from automatic reaction to authentic inquiry is the beginning of integration. And the moment you begin, something in every relationship you inhabit starts to shift. Leave the number 111 in the comments. In the symbolic and psychological framework Jung developed across his lifetime, 111 represents the first genuine awakening to what has been operating in the shadow, the specific moment when unconscious patterns become visible and the authentic work of integration can commence. If shadow integration is the most pressing and most immediate work your psychology is summoning you toward, 111 is your signal. Leave it here. The second behavior is what Jung described as necessary psychological separation from inherited identity. Jung identified a critical developmental passage that every genuinely maturing person must eventually traverse. He called it the necessary separation from the primary matrix, the moment when the individual must liberate themselves from the psychological framework transmitted to them by their family system. Beliefs, anxieties, and definitions of success and failure they absorbed must be examined, interrogated, and in many cases, consciously outgrown. Not as an act of defiance, as an act of psychological birth. Most people never accomplish this work. They carry their family's convictions, their family's fears, their family's ceiling on what is achievable, all the way into adulthood, and designate it their own identity. They adopt their parents' frameworks without scrutinizing them. They internalize their parents' emotional patterns and replay them in their adult connections. And then they wonder why they keep encountering the same barriers. Why something always appears to be drawing them backward, regardless of how intentionally they are attempting to progress. Jung called this the failure to achieve moral autonomy. A person who has never genuinely distinguished their psychological identity from their family of origin is not yet fully themselves. They are a continuation of a narrative that was never originally theirs. The separation Jung described is not about rejecting your origins or severing connections dramatically. It is about consciously determining which dimensions of your inheritance you carry forward and which you deliberately release. It demands an intellectual and emotional courage that most people circumvent because it requires seeing the people who raised them as human beings with genuine limitations, rather than infallible authorities. But what exists on the other side of that discomfort is something genuinely rare, a moral compass that is authentically yours. Values selected from within carry a stability and a consistency that borrowed values can never replicate. People register that distinction. They perceive the difference between someone who holds convictions because they consciously chose them and someone who holds them because they were transmitted. One carries genuine authority. The other yields under pressure. The individuals who command the deepest and most enduring respect are almost invariably those who have completed this separation. They are not readily swayed by social pressure because their identity does not depend on collective consensus. They can maintain an unpopular position because their sense of self is not contingent on being agreed with. The third behavior is conscious independence, and this one penetrates deeply because it challenges something most people were conditioned to regard as a virtue. The distinction matters enormously here. Needing others for genuine love, for real connection, for community, these are healthy and necessary human requirements. What we are addressing is something categorically different: the specific dependency on other people's approval to feel acceptable within yourself, requiring their reaction to confirm that your choices carry any actual weight. That variety of dependency is not love. It is psychological outsourcing, and it gradually dissolves your sense of self from within, slowly enough that most people never register the erosion until the damage is already substantial. Jung wrote extensively about individuation, the complete emergence of the genuine autonomous self. Not the self your parents constructed for you or that your culture determined was appropriate. The self that resides beneath all of that accumulated conditioning. And reaching that self requires one step that cannot be circumvented. You must cease building your identity from other people's responses to you. Conscious independence is not isolation. It is self-sovereignty, being so clearly established in who you are that you can be fully present with others without secretly requiring something from them in exchange for feeling complete. That quality alone transforms every encounter you have. People stop experiencing you as someone to manage. They begin experiencing you as someone worth genuinely engaging with. Furthermore, and this is where Jung's insight becomes particularly significant, individuals who achieve genuine internal autonomy actually develop a greater capacity for real connection, not a diminished one. Because when you stop urgently needing approval, you begin selecting relationships freely, and connection built on genuine preference rather than fear of solitude is immeasurably more powerful than dependent attachment ever was. Leave the number 444 in the comments. In the symbolic language that informed Jung's understanding of psychological development, 444 represents the stable and enduring interior foundation, the quality of self-possession that emerges when you stop constructing your identity from external feedback and begin building it from authentic interior knowing. If conscious independence is the work your psychology is most urgently calling you toward, 444 marks that recognition. Leave it here. The fourth behavior is strategic solitude, the deliberate, consciously chosen practice of being genuinely alone with yourself as a genuine source of strength rather than a symptom of social inadequacy. There exists a variety of solitude that represents avoidance, a retreat from existence driven by fear or incapacity for genuine relationship. That is not what we are describing. What we are pointing toward is something categorically different. The intentional practice of withdrawing from social noise to remember who you actually are beneath all the performance, all the accumulated roles, all the unexamined expectations that accumulate like weight over time without your conscious agreement. Jung regarded this practice not as optional, but as genuinely essential to psychological well-being. Without consistent periods of authentic solitude, he believed, a person gradually loses contact with their own interior life. They are steadily absorbed into the collective, into the unrelenting current of other people's needs and perspectives, until they are no longer certain what they actually think about anything at all. A person who never allocates meaningful time to genuine aloneness is continuously being defined by their environment. Their emotional state is determined by how others treated them on any given day. Their sense of worth rises and descends with social feedback. Their decisions emerge from external pressure rather than internal clarity. Your solitude is not loneliness. It is a refuge where you remember who you are beneath the noise. It is where your genuine self recovers and clarifies and breathes. In a world that profits from your perpetual distraction and perpetual availability, choosing deliberate aloneness with your own mind is one of the most quietly radical and most genuinely powerful practices available to you. Protect that practice with the seriousness it deserves, because what solitude reveals that no social environment ever can is what you actually want. Not what you are instructed to want, not what everyone in your vicinity appears to be pursuing, but what you specifically, with your specific nature and your specific interior landscape, genuinely care about. That information exists only in the quiet. Leave the number 528 in the comments. In the vibrational and symbolic framework that extends the archetypal language Jung developed throughout his career, 528 represents the frequency of genuine interior clarity, the specific resonance of a consciousness that has learned to access its own truth through sustained and intentional quiet. If strategic solitude is something you have been postponing or consistently undervaluing in your life, 528 is your signal. Leave it here. The fifth behavior is circumambulation, the relentless, genuinely curious, sustained circling of the self to comprehend the authentic why beneath every instinct, every pattern, every habitual response you carry. Not a direct pursuit of immediate answers, a spiral, moving around and around the center of who you are, each revolution uncovering something the previous one could not access. Most people never genuinely circle anything. They navigate existence accepting reality at its presented surface. Someone presents something as established truth, and they file it without examination. Someone demonstrates a pattern, and they receive it as inevitable, rather than inquiring what generated it. Jung maintained a deep and consistent skepticism toward people who had ceased questioning, who had settled into a fixed identity and a fixed constellation of beliefs and abandoned examination. He observed that the most pervasive source of psychological suffering in contemporary people was not external circumstance, but unconscious conformity. The quiet, accumulating practice of absorbing other people's frameworks for reality without deliberately choosing them. Circumambulation is the specific counterforce to this. The commitment to persistently ask why. Why do I hold this belief? Why does this particular pattern recur in my experience? Why am I responding in this specific way to this specific situation? These are not comfortable questions. They unravel false certainties that felt like solid ground. And that unraveling, as disorienting as it feels in the moment, is the genuine beginning of psychological freedom. The person practicing circumambulation is not merely more engaging to converse with. They are more authentically free than almost anyone surrounding them, because they are not executing inherited frameworks without awareness. They are operating from genuine, deliberate choice. They have become what Jung described as the conscious author of their own interior life, rather than its unconscious inheritor. This also fundamentally transforms the quality of your relationships. The person who asks genuine questions, who is authentically curious about what lies beneath the surface of ideas and behavior, generates a quality of exchange that shallow social interaction can never replicate. People feel genuinely heard differently in the presence of someone who is truly inquiring rather than simply waiting for their opportunity to respond. The sixth behavior is what Jung called the radiance of individuation, the specific quality of presence that belongs to someone who has completed sufficient interior work and emerged from it genuinely and irreversibly altered. He designated this the manna personality. When a person who has genuinely confronted their shadow, achieved separation from inherited conditioning, and is neither performing nor seeking approval, simply enters a space as they actually are, something in that space shifts. Not because they intend to produce that effect, because authentic presence functions as a mirror, reflecting back to everyone in its proximity the specific distance between who they are and who they are currently performing being. And that reflection is not always comfortable to receive. Jung documented with remarkable consistency that genuinely individuated people frequently generated discomfort in others without any deliberate intention of doing so. Not through aggression or confrontation, simply through the contrast their groundedness created with the performances surrounding them. Think about this with genuine attention. Have you ever been in the presence of someone who required nothing from the interaction, who did not compete for position or acknowledgement, and yet felt, in their company, an inexplicable impulse to justify yourself? That is the radiance of individuation functioning precisely as Jung described. It is not that they are evaluating you. They are not. It is that the contrast between their genuine groundedness and your own performance becomes suddenly and uncomfortably visible in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. The reaction this generates is reliably divided. Some people are drawn toward that presence immediately, almost magnetically. They recognize something authentic when they encounter it and feel its rarity. Others manufacture justifications to criticize or dismiss it. Both responses are entirely predictable. Both are precisely what Jung would have anticipated. The people drawn toward it are those prepared to grow. The people who resist it are those whose comfortable constructions are challenged by genuine authenticity. Your full presence is not something to be apologized for or deliberately moderated. Show up completely. Hold your ground without hostility. Be willing to generate honest discomfort, not through difficulty, but through genuine realness. The seventh and final behavior is the one that most decisively separates the genuinely psychologically rare from everyone else. The will to be unpopular in service of meaning. The willingness to consistently choose substance over social acceptance when the two arrive in direct opposition. Human beings are wired for belonging at the most fundamental biological level. The fear of social exclusion activates the identical neural pathways as physical pain. This is not a character weakness. It is ancient survival architecture. For the vast majority of human history, being excluded from the collective was a genuinely life-threatening circumstance. So the drive to conform, to smooth over genuine differences for the sake of belonging, is not something you can simply reason yourself past. It is inscribed in your biology. But here is what Jung observed with uncomfortable precision. A person who consistently permits that biological drive to override their deeper values does not merely forfeit a richer existence. They begin dying psychologically, slowly, imperceptibly, in increments so minute they barely register at first. The self that could have emerged continues to contract with every compromise made for the sake of being liked. Every moment you suppress something genuine to preserve the atmosphere. Every time you nod along to something you do not actually believe. And across years, very little authentic self remains. Just the smooth, accommodating surface of someone who forgot they possessed an interior. Jung called the life unlived, the existence that never became fully itself because of this persistent erosion, one of the great psychological tragedies available to human experience. And its primary source was almost invariably identical. The need to be approved of, placed consistently above the need to be honest. A person has a genuine perspective in a conversation, a position that genuinely challenges the dominant view in the room. They feel it forming with clarity and conviction, and then they scan the environment and sense the invisible pressure of consensus. They swallow it. They adjust their expression to align with the majority, and afterward they carry a familiar heaviness they have grown so habituated to bearing they no longer even name it. That is the accumulated weight of unlived moments. Multiplied across thousands of similar surrenders over a lifetime, it becomes the defining texture of a leased life that was never quite fully inhabited. Contrast this with someone who has made an internal determination that meaning carries more authority than approval. They do not voice every thought they have. They are not contrary for its own satisfaction. But when they carry something genuinely real to contribute, they contribute it. Even when it lands without warmth, even when it creates momentary discomfort, even when it costs them some social ease. And here is the paradox Jung identified with remarkable clarity. These individuals, the ones willing to be the dissenting voice in service of truth, ultimately command far more lasting respect than those who kept themselves contracted for approval. Because every person in the room recognizes, at some level beneath conscious articulation, when someone is actually saying what they genuinely think. And that variety of honesty is so uncommon in most environments that it registers immediately as something different, something more substantial, someone genuinely worth attending to. Your willingness to occupy the discomfort of being the odd voice is not stubbornness, it is integrity. Genuine integrity does not announce itself. It radiates outward. It alters the atmosphere of a space, and it draws toward you precisely the people capable of recognizing depth when they encounter it. Because here is what nobody explicitly tells you about choosing meaning over popularity. You do not end up isolated. You end up with fewer people, but far more genuinely aligned ones. The ones capable of holding the complete version of who you are, rather than a curated, softened approximation of it. And that exchange is worth making without exception or hesitation. Subscribe to Carl Jung philosophy and continue this journey with us, because what Jung ultimately understood about these 7 behaviors is that they are not social strategies. They are the specific and demanding practices through which a human being stops performing a version of themselves for an audience and starts inhabiting the genuine article. Depth attracts depth. Authenticity draws authenticity. The more completely you show up as yourself, the more you will find yourself surrounded by people genuinely capable of meeting that level of realness. And every person incapable of holding it will quietly withdraw. Not because you repelled them, but because the contrast between authentic presence and comfortable performance became too stark to remain within. Leave the number 777 in the comments. In the symbolic language of quantum consciousness and the deep archetypal framework that informed Jung's entire understanding of the relationship between genuine individual development and the quality of a life fully inhabited, 777 represents the complete and irreversible alignment of who you actually are with how you actually live. The specific moment when you stop constructing a performance of yourself for external consumption and begin occupying the real thing with full and unapologetic commitment. If these 7 behaviors have genuinely illuminated something about where your worth actually resides and what is actually required to embody it, 777 is your declaration. Leave it here. Your depth is not a burden to be managed or a quality to be moderated for the comfort of others. It is the most substantial thing you carry. And the world, the specific part of it that is actually ready, needs you to stop diminishing it. Before we close, I want to speak directly to something that these 7 behaviors point toward, but never quite name explicitly. Because behind every technique, behind every framework, behind every behavioral map that psychology offers, there is a human being who has been quietly carrying something extraordinary without any adequate language for what it actually is or why it has always cost so much. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. You have read those words before, perhaps many times. And perhaps each time you read them, something in you responds, something that recognizes the truth of them. And then something else arrives immediately afterward, a quiet, persistent question. But what if becoming who I truly am costs me the people I love most? What if the full version of me is genuinely too much for the life I have built? What if the real thing is harder to carry than the performance? Those questions are not obstacles to your becoming. They are the evidence of it. The person who has never genuinely begun the process of individuation does not ask those questions because they have never felt the specific weight of what they are carrying. You ask them because you have already crossed a threshold that most people spend their entire lives standing just outside of. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. That sentence is not motivational language. It is a clinical observation from someone who watched thousands of people arrive at the edge of their own genuine self, and then, quietly, carefully, almost imperceptibly, step back. Not because they lacked intelligence or desire or good intentions. Because accepting yourself completely requires something that no amount of intellectual understanding can substitute for. It requires the willingness to stop negotiating with yourself about which parts of you are acceptable enough to be allowed into the room. You have been negotiating that your entire life, deciding which parts to present and which to conceal, which parts of your depth to offer, and which to keep carefully contained so that the people around you remain comfortable enough to stay. That negotiation has been exhausting, and it has been lonely in a way that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never felt it. The specific loneliness of being partially present in every room you enter because the full version of you has never felt entirely safe to bring. Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. Carl Jung. The 7 behaviors we explored today are not additions to who you are. They are the systematic removal of everything that has been preventing who you actually are from being fully visible to others, and far more importantly, to yourself. The shadow work, the separation from inherited identity. the independence from external validation, the solitude, the questioning, the radiance, the willingness to be unpopular in service of something real. None of it